Hey everyone, how you doing? Time to check in on the right wing. Wait, they're really arguing that a mermaid can't be black? Actually, let's leave the right wing today. Let's talk about the left instead. This is the first video in a series on why I'm an anarchist and not a Marxist. This series isn't going to be bitter and spiteful. I don't hate Marxists or other kinds of leftists, and there's plenty we could do together. I don't mean to make this personal or even specific, just very general, at least in the first video, regarding not just Marxists, but lots of people who could be called the left. So if you're not like the people I describe, or if you're a liberal, I'm not talking about you. I just want to talk about the many differences between anarchists, or at least me, and the rest of the left. I'll be making a number of points in this video and expanding on them, some of them at least, later in this series. I became an anarchist after a long period of studying history, political economy, and the state. I did a lot of listening to people, friends, people on social media, and they helped shape my thought a lot. But reading anarchist theory is what made me an anarchist. One difference between anarchism and Marxism is to be a Marxist you need to read Marx, or prominent Marxists, depending who you ask. To be an anarchist you just need to think no one should dominate and enslave anyone else. Many people reach that conclusion without books, through experience or independent thought, and they don't all call themselves anarchists. You don't have to. And some Marxists probably think similarly, but to the extent it's represented by people who call themselves Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, or Marxist-Leninist-Maoists, modern Marxism doesn't have the same commitment to freedom as anarchism. It's common to say, or maybe assume, the end point of socialism, as it were, is the same regardless of which type of leftist you're talking to. Socialism should mean the liberation of the workers, probably through their collective ownership of the means of production. A situation where a community doesn't use money, property, or hierarchy to organize could be called communism, or a commune. However, it often seems to me Marxists, or at least the ones I talk to, aren't so concerned with liberation. They tend to be more concerned with finding the correct analysis, the correct way of thinking, the correct way to rule, the correct allies in the present, which never seems to lead to liberation in the long term. There isn't always just one right answer, you know? Just like there isn't just one issue that's more important than all the others, one way to overthrow capitalism, one leader we should follow, or one guy who understood everything so well we should build a movement around him. Even if you think Marx is the best sociologist ever, only so many people are going to join your movement if you name it after a great man of history and insist everyone read and analyze several thick volumes before they can be proper members. Whereas anarchism has a simple message: you and everyone else should be free. The questions concern how to get there. Again, you don't have to read theory or call yourself an anarchist to agree. In my experience, most Marxists have a somewhat incomplete understanding of the state, and it's fundamental to freedom and philosophy and socialism, so I think they should be learning from anarchists. The problem that Marxists and almost everyone else I know has in analyzing the state is they see the state as a neutral tool for organization that has to be there, rather than a tool for domination. They think if the right people are in power, they can use the state to liberate people, end fascism, and do all the other things the transitional socialist state is tasked with. I think that belief is misguided. The state, in its modern and ancient forms, has only ever existed to oppress. Its purpose is to concentrate power over the people in its territory and live off their labor. It's first the result of conquest and then the vehicle for more conquest. Because the state is inherently extremely violent, it needs to constantly reinforce its legitimacy, so it takes on new functions like hospitals. But its core purpose is still to use violence to defend social hierarchy. Many leftists think the right people can transform the state into something that it isn't, something that isn't solely for oppression. And I don't see how. To me, it's like trying to transform a tiger into a dog so you can play with it. The tiger's instincts and claws don't just go away. They just get used on other people. The Marxists I've talked to have said the state's just a tool for organization, the ideal tool for organizing society, or at least a necessary tool for achieving communism. They think the state is simply there, neutral, an empty vessel that any class can come along and fill. They talk about the class character of the state, which means if the working class controls it, it's a good state. But the state has certain inherent characteristics that make a state run by the entire proletariat, or even for it, impossible. I've even heard them say a Marxist state works for the people, unlike a capitalist state. Marxist police and prisons work for the people, unlike capitalist prisons. No, I'm sorry. No states work for the people. They're structurally incapable of doing so. And based on what Marx I've read, I think he might agree with me. But anyway, that's another thing I'm planning on following up on in more detail later in this series. After all, I like Marx, but too much of what gets called Marxism and socialism nowadays is just some stuff Lenin and Mao said. For one thing, the state is less a tool of organization than of force. It can't stop using force, or it's not a state. If by organizing society what you want is to use force on everyone through laws, taxes, labor, and so on, then okay, but that's not socialism or anything different from before. Using the state as it was always intended to force everyone, leads to the next problem. Marxists say their goal is the future communist society, right, where there's no money, no classes, no state. But their plan, with its prescribed stages, couldn't possibly lead to that. No state will ever wither away, because the people controlling it will never just give up their power. Just like capital, states will always try to perpetuate themselves. In fact, the state has nothing to do with capital, inherently, because they've always worked this way, even before money was invented, though you could call them proto-states, but still. People with power over others don't give it up unless they're forced to. The state's class character is always that of the ruling class, which is always a small minority of the population. There are no other kinds of states. Any theories that say the state can work for all the people are fantasy. In fact, many Marxists will tell you the state will wither after it has ended all classes. That's what Engels wrote. Well, maybe not the word wither, but that it would go away, it would cease to be, it would become irrelevant. Socialism, people will tell me, is a transitional state that will eventually no longer be necessary. However, it's the state that creates classes, and therefore class antagonism. It's the state that creates laws, money, and property as tools of class rule, and the state would never simply give up its power, which is why they would never try to empower the workers, but keep them ignorant, servile, and dependent. The state might be able to more or less manage the common interests of the bourgeoisie, to paraphrase Marx in the Communist Manifesto, but the ruling class is usually the smallest class. And even among the rich, the state will only try to represent you to the extent that you don't antagonize anyone too high up in it. You still have to play the game and pay your dues. But the working class is most people. If you think one party can and should represent all those people, you might think that the state could be transformed to serve most or all people's interests. But it's not that simple. The entire proletariat, or any class, is too big to comprise the state. It will be some rulers at the top and a million bureaucrats enacting policy. The state is necessarily a tiny minority of the population. It doesn't just respond to everything people with money want. The state has a life of its own, with its own influences and priorities. Not everything it does is because of money. It might be about power, and the power of state officials is not the same as the power of capitalists. Money leads to power, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And I should mention, I'm not saying Marxists don't know any of this, but they tend not to recognize it in books or discussions. The problem is the concentration of power. Giving institutional power to individuals over the lives of others leads to laws, which lead to inequality, which lead to police and punishment, which require propaganda to justify. People use power for their own benefit. It doesn't matter all that much what they believed before they took power, which is why anarchists don't waste time building the party and contesting elections. States divide the population into rulers who own things and make laws, and ruled who do all the work. The goal of revolution shouldn't be to swap rulers, but to do away with the systems that enable people to concentrate power over others. That's why working class liberation doesn't consist only of eliminating the state and capital, but also white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, and every other ideology that's hurting people. Moreover, states need enemies. Enemies give legitimacy to the hierarchy, making us believe we need strong leaders at the top going after the official bad guys. Even if they run out of old ones, they'll make new enemies, like anarchists, for example, although I suppose that's just a joke, because if history is any guide, the anarchists would have been the first killed off under the new dictatorship. So maybe the next enemy will be labeled the lumpen proletariat or something and get forced into work camps. If the great men said they're the enemy, they're the enemy. One of the gotchas Leninists have for talking with anarchists is the term successful revolutions. There's an assumption among Leninists that certain states, such as China, Vietnam, and Cuba, are socialist, and are therefore an example of successful socialist revolutions. But then, if you think that, are you actually a communist? Which of these revolutions ever even approximated communism? When have they ever taken steps in that direction? What Leninists mean when they talk about successful revolutions is successfully overthrowing a government. A successful anarchist revolution or successfully implementing communism would be a much wider, deeper change. If you're bragging about successful Marxist revolutions, you're implying that to you, a revolution is just a change in government, or coup, not a deeply rooted, grassroots-driven, culture-wide change in social conditions and relations. In this hypothetical system, even if we've eliminated capitalism and fascism the world over, we'll still have the tyranny of the state, which means we'll still be legally limited to those behaviors our rulers allow, like working all day. And we'll still have enemies, presumably lawbreakers and striking workers, and anyone who doesn't want to follow someone else's plan for them. I don't want a new state. I want liberation for all. The plan seems to be lots of state violence until the people who benefit most from that violence choose to stop it. They call it a science. If only we gave all power to the right group of philosopher kings who are following the science laid down by a couple of guys in the 19th century, we would have paradise on earth. Leninists will pepper discussions with buzzwords like contradictions, materialist, not idealist, and scientific, not utopian. Some folks who assume what they know is a science will also think everything they think is based on facts, or, material conditions, and as such they've discovered the one correct way to reach communism. Why is it then that every application of this science leads to highly authoritarian states and then capitalism? A lot of Marxists believe after they take over the state, they're going to implement socialism by building productive forces. But really, it sounds to me like capitalism with new bosses. And these bosses are just as keen as the old ones to produce, so they work you just as hard. Like all primitive accumulation, industrialization in so-called socialist states has meant slavery, with all its horrors for millions of people forced off their land and into the factory. But I guess suffering for the socialist cause is good, or they were all reactionaries, or whatever. Leninists, MLs, promise revolution and liberation, but only in the distant future after they change the entire world. Can you really claim to believe in the people and the workers if you don't believe in their ability to defend or govern themselves? You have a program for them, a plan for them, and if they don't want to be part of your plan, they'll be criminals, just like you were before the revolution. Thus, you will have recreated the system of criminalization and punishment, just like we have today, the very thing you sought to destroy. Unless, of course, the point of the revolution was just so you could be in charge. There certainly are plenty of online MLs and other leftists who positively salivate at the prospect of being a guard at the People's Re-Education Gulag. But then they'd probably just be used as fodder in the so-called revolution and end up on the other side of the bars. That's what history would suggest, anyway. The dictatorship of the proletariat inevitably becomes dictatorship over the proletariat. As Small C Communist points out, the most basic principle socialists ought to have is that oppressed people should lead their own struggles for freedom, without the presence of narcissistic saviors, self-appointed middlemen, or any other concentrations of power away from the group as a whole. You don't need a science to understand oppression. We don't all have to follow the same plan to get free. We don't all have our specific role to play. There's a lot to do and we can do it all, but not if we follow some rigid plan, least of all one inspired entirely by people from more than 100 years ago. One thing about power and rule is you need to make compromises with unlikely bedfellows. Judging by their behavior both in historical Leninist states and many of today's just Marxist-Leninists and their behavior, there's little hope the new masters will stick to communist principles. They'd probably band together with whatever other powerful groups they couldn't destroy, like the right wing, to go after anarchists, or just to take power. But it's clear why they would go after anarchists. The new rulers want to rule unchallenged, and anarchists are a constant challenge to rulers. Anarchists would resist the consolidation of a new kind of power, whatever it was. They would fight back against the purges and pogroms. They wouldn't let the new state indoctrinate everyone into its version of the truth. Anarchists are thus always among the first victims of the new state, which is why I have a hard time considering a Leninist an ally. All I see is someone who wants to use me as bullet fodder in a revolt and then throw me in a gulag. Not all Marxists want to recreate Leninist states, of course, but their voices get crowded out in discussion, so we don't hear from dissenters. There are anarchists in popular movements and even distinct anarchist movements all around the world. Why have you never heard of them? Same reason everyone shits on anarchists. They're a threat to the established order, including a Marxist one. Only anarchists will tell you about anarchist movements and achievements. Check out this video for some examples of societies that have achieved liberation. Those examples of real-life anarchy and anarchism come closer to fulfilling communist ideals than Leninist states because of the nature of their revolution, the dominant beliefs guiding the participants, and the way they work to defend their freedom. Just because you don't know about the people and their work doesn't mean they're not doing it, or that they're CIA assets, or whatever other nonsense leftists tell themselves to continue to dismiss us. There should be no disconnect between means and ends. If the end is to empower everyone as equals, that should take place at every stage of the revolution, not just after a long period of the opposite. I don't even think of the revolution as if it were an event. It would be a series of events over years in different parts of the world. Some anarchists would say revolution is really hard to achieve, maybe even impossible, and decentralized insurrection is a better method for the present. What's more, while we tend to be pushing for liberation, there really is no end goal for anarchism because things could always be better. I think we need harmony between means and ends, and liberation should be part of what we do now, not just a vague hope for the future. I think we need to understand the present system and envision the future. That's kind of why this channel exists. Most Marxists I've talked to seem to be stuck in the present system. That is, they don't envision something much better, radically different, truly revolutionary. Without this vision, they risk reproducing relations of dominance, instead of flattening the social hierarchy. Revolution's great, but if it recreates the state, maintains a class structure, money, property, borders, etc., then all the bloodshed will have been in vain. Some socialists defend states with no connection to socialism, because authority and violence and domination are okay, as long as the people doing it claim to be socialist or anti-imperialist, and the gray zone backs it all up. It's easy to write off everything your favorite government does as mistakes. I don't agree with everything he did, but other states do worses, etc. But in the end, it sounds the same as an Elon Musk fanboy. Why are you idolizing great men at all? I thought it was about the workers, the freedom of the people. Turns out they just want to hear more promises. We don't need just one correct analysis and one plan for revolution. Some Marxists, again, not all, I'm sure, seem to think if you just have the one dialectical answer to any question, you have the right answer. So if you just analyze your situation properly, you'll know the correct way to revolution. But revolution's not something that can be planned, nor is there a clear goal or an end point. The Zapatistas have been resisting for decades. Look at their revolution. They're not doing it the Marxist way, and for that matter, they're not doing it the anarchist way. They're doing it their way. That's how revolution will inevitably occur. Various groups acting independently, doing things the way they think is right. We don't need big R revolutions. To me, Marxism feels like a symptom of the tendency to complicate things unnecessarily. For sure, the systems we study are complex, but it's easy to lose sight of liberation as the goal. It's no wonder there are so many Marxist academics, to me. You can kind of sit back and pontificate instead of getting your hands dirty. Not that they aren't worth reading. I've read lots of Marxists studying poli-sci, and because I like neo-Gramscian hegemony theory. But freedom is not as complicated as neo-Gramscian hegemony theory. Just stop forcing people. Organize society so no one can coerce others. What's wrong with mutual aid other than the fact that most people don't understand it? Mutual aid is people providing for each other, whether food, housing, a hug, or protection from the imperial military. It's about empowering people as equals to get involved and make their lives and their society better together. That way we don't depend on corporations or governments to provide everything. On a wide enough scale, mutual aid is the basis for a free society. Why spend all that time in a vanguard organization, collecting fees and contacting members and handing out leaflets when you could get together with the people, figure out what everyone needs and how to get it? People will get involved if it benefits and empowers them. Anyway, as I say, I'm planning to expand on some of these points over the next few weeks, but if there's anything you want me to address, let me know in the comments. So why am I not a Marxist? I don't really agree that the working class can be represented by a state or anyone. I don't think what Marxists do is as effective as what anarchists do. I think means and ends need to match, and our work needs to educate and empower people at every stage, which requires organizing horizontally without hierarchy. I take a broad view of revolution and insurrection and mutual aid. I'm confident free people can organize themselves. We can learn from Marx and Marxists. I just don't think we should base a whole movement on them. Thanks.